So we are here to kind of expand on the conversation that we touched on a little bit a couple months ago, which was kind of the idea of being like a Swiss Army knife. And we're going to dive into that a little bit more deeply based on a book that you and I have both read, Range by David Epstein. And so as we start to get into this a little bit, I know that you and I both, before we start talking about the generalist and before we really dive into the value of having kind of breadth of knowledge, we both also want to acknowledge the application of a specialist. So before we go too deep into a generalist, talk to me a little bit about the role that you see of a specialist, specifically in athletic training, but just in general too, of what they have to lend to the conversation and just to the application of this topic overall.
Right. So the system doesn't work without specialists and generalists.
Yeah.
And I think specialists serve a really important purpose, and that's to take on difficult cases. That's to take on atypical cases. So cases that may not follow the typical presentation pattern that we see for any condition that we may see as an athletic trainer or in medicine, if you will. And this idea of a specialist goes into beyond healthcare, into like the difference between someone who's a handyman versus a plumber or an electrician. There is a role for those specialized individuals, and I think in athletic training, they have the opportunity to fill a much needed role, because oftentimes athletic trainers have been asked to be both the specialist on everything. They've been asked to be a generalist, but a specialist on everything. And I think that's the nuance in this conversation, is that it's really about reframing the framework by which collectively we practice as athletic trainers, in which we have specialists in high need areas or niche areas. And we also have generalists who don't have to be specialists in every single practice area.
Right. And the topic that comes to mind immediately when I think about this is concussions. So this was something that really emerged in our field as something very prominent, very dangerous. Everybody started paying attention to it at once. We were the ones on the front lines. And suddenly it's like we have to digest large amounts of information on a regular basis with science that is changing so rapidly, all while doing everything else at the same time. Like you can't become weaker in your ankle evaluations. Your documentation standards can't lessen, all while trying to consume large amounts of information related to a very specialized type of injury. And I think now, or maybe just what we're moving towards, is that we realize you've got to refer those kinds of things out. Like you need to be able to have the education or the wherewithal to identify it, do immediate evaluation and treatment as needed in that space. But otherwise, it's like that's a specialized condition, and as are a lot of things. And I agree with you. I think that that's one of probably several that we could touch on. That's like, we kind of just get it thrown at us because of the population that we work with and because of the emphasis that's placed on it by society. But then we're like rapidly trying to figure out, how does this belong in all of the other things I have to balance, right?
Yeah, it's almost like we've been unfair to ourselves, or that the people we work with and the space we work with has been unfair to us. If we actually zoom out and look at neurotrauma or concussions or head injuries, there are people who that's their entire job. They don't do anything else. And I'm not talking about athletic training. I'm talking in medicine, in physical therapy, in
Right.
many other of our other healthcare professions. There are individuals that the only patient panel they see are concussions or neurotrauma injuries and conditions.
Hmm.
We've been asked to maintain a high level of competency and proficiency across all of the conditions that we see in our practice,
Yeah.
and somehow become this expert or or become a specialist in concussion management. And that's
Yeah.
just unfair. Like, athletic
Right.
trainers are amazing, and
Yeah.
we can do amazing things, but I think it's an unfair position to put ourselves in, that we need to be specialized in this one area and then still do our entire job. I absolutely believe that every single athletic trainer should be able to identify, recognize, and triage a head injury,
Absolutely.
and to ensure that the patient is safe, the patient doesn't return to play, the patient is not putting themselves at an increased risk if a concussion does exist.
Right.
But the idea that we need to know every single way that that they can be rehabilitated, or that they can
Yes.
return to play, to return to learn, all of the different techniques, the different graded return to exercise tests,
Yeah.
that is unfair. I think that it's just an unfair position that we put ourselves in, and it's an unfair position that I think we fill in this need because we so much want to be needed, and this is an area that we
Mm.
see a lot of emphasis from external stakeholders being put on, that this is something we need.
Mm.
It puts us internally at a disadvantage because we always feel behind. As
Yes.
you mentioned, the literature and the new knowledge and the new information, the new wisdom that's coming out in concussion and neurotrauma conditions change every day. And
Literally. Yeah. Yeah.
literally change every day. And we that is an unrealistic pace to keep up, in addition to being able to do all of the other things that we're asked to do as a healthcare provider for all of the patients we see, just not the small percentage that have a concussion.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I think that that perfectly frames kind of why we wanted to have this discussion, is because there's so many of us out there who are practicing as isolated healthcare providers. We may have a sports medicine team that we can refer out to, and a physician, obviously, but so many of us are in the moment trying to figure out, how do I manage the concussion while treating the ankle sprain, rehabilitating the ACL, and monitoring the heat index. Like, there's so many things that we are asked to do, and I think it's part of our beauty. It's part of the value that we do bring to the healthcare market, and really to our clients, the people, the organizations that we work for. But I think for us to be able to have a conversation out loud, giving permission to those people to say, it's okay to not know every single detail about concussion management. It is okay to rely on your county of education to determine when the heat index is too high. Like, you don't necessarily have to carry that burden. And when I think about like a policy and procedure manual, so when I was working in the secondary school, or even all the work that we do with clients right now, we develop the policy and procedures for the school districts. And I mean, these things are thick, because the breadth of what an athletic trainer covers, from the different types of injuries, and all of the EAPs associated with the specific venues, to all of the inclement weather, whether that's cold or tornado or lightning or heat, to any type of mass shooting incident. And like, it goes on and on and on. And then cardiovascular, and then the PPE and what we're screening for. Like, there's so much that an athletic trainer is asked to know. And I really feel like we've gotten to a point clinically as we're seeing these standard changes where we're being asked to bring on new skills that widen us, that increase our breadth of what we're able to do, that we need to have that permission to set some of the other things down. And I feel like that's kind of the premise of our conversation today.
Absolutely. And it's really about redefining or reconstructing or reframing how we view ourselves as professionals and as humans.
Mm,
It's okay not to be able to know everything,
yeah.
right? Because if we do that and we where we try to do it and we fail, we're human.
Hmm.
We're asking ourselves, we are setting unrealistic expectations for ourselves.
Yeah.
And the reasons could be, there are probably tens of reasons why we take
Totally.
that on, and that's a time for a different conversation. But
Yeah.
where we have evolved as a profession, we are now at a point where there is specialized knowledge.
Yes.
So I think up until recently, I would say the past 15 years, there probably wasn't, we hadn't professionally evolved or developed collectively to be specialized areas of practice, not
Hmm.
practice setting. We have done a great job of expanding our
True.
practice
Yeah.
setting,
Good
but
point. Hmm.
we've stuck to the same domains of athletic training across the practice settings.
Hmm.
Some people do more of one than the other,
Right.
but we've developed this place to this moment in time. Now we can start to develop a depth of practice specialization, not practice specialization, but system specialization. So
Hmm.
neurotrauma, orthopedics, prevention,
Right.
right? So if we can move ourselves into this specialized area of knowledge, and when we do that, which there has been such an emphasis on residencies and clinical specialists recently,
Yes.
when we do that, we can forget that we also need to have an army of caring, competent, and compassionate generalists who
Yes.
are there, who are the face of athletic training, who
Yeah.
are those individuals who have the regular interactions and develop the rapport that many of us love in the
Yeah.
profession with those patients. And that is a skill set in and of itself. And we have to allow ourselves to personally evolve, to not have to hold everything and not bear the pressure of
Mm.
the depth and breadth of every single system or practice setting or specialized knowledge base. And once we release ourselves personally, then we professionally, collectively can move forward into a new model where we
Yeah.
have frontline generalists and backline specialists that
Yeah.
work symbiotically, and athletic trainers are referring to athletic trainers, and athletic trainers are referring back to athletic trainers.
Yeah.
And it's a really exciting future to see. And it's
Yeah.
also a little daunting because for someone who grew up in the mid 2000s from an athletic training education perspective, that
Uh-huh.
was not my reality.
Right.
And that's really not the reality for most practicing athletic trainers now and most
True.
young professional athletic trainers. Um, and shifting to that mindset requires us to give up some of our notions of what it looks like to be an athletic trainer and what it looks like to be a competent and proficient and caring athletic trainer. You can care about the patients that you work with and not know everything.
Yeah. Absolutely. When you're talking, the example that's coming to mind is kind of what David Epstein brings up in Range, which is for so long we have been committed to this idea of 10,000 hours of practice, right? And that we can develop into this type of perfect specialist, that we kind of reach our peak once we've put in our time. And he very much debunks that with this theory, or this kind of idea of like a kind world versus a wicked world, right? And so in a kind world, we have fixed variables. So he uses chess or golf, where there's only so many scenarios that can exist because it's a finite game. I knew that all of it would start interweaving at one point. When you're playing a finite game, which is essentially the kind world that he refers to, and what we've referenced in previous talks, whether that's like war or literally the game of sport, there are ways to win or achieve success, or at least from an outward perspective, achieve success, because you can train your brain to recognize patterns and models and things like that. And in an unkind world, in an infinite game, there are infinite possibilities of what something can be. And that very much is the world that we live in of healthcare and of just the delivery of our services.
Mhm.
We are given algorithms, SOAP evaluations and things that we can do in order to structurally evaluate something and come to a predetermined or a determined assessment. But it only takes watching one episode of House to know that when you approach something with cookie cutter methods, like you're going to overlook. And David Epstein does this in Rain, like literally it's an entire book of just example after example, whether it's in the science world or in your career or whatever it is, that like the specialization, it just does not lend itself to always making not only like the best decisions, but really even wide open thinking or like critical evaluation of a situation, given all the potential factors that could be weighing into it.
Exactly. I love how it debunks really the 10,000 hour rule. The 10,000 hour rule was studied on violinists. Playing violin is a very discrete skill, or
Yes.
just like maybe performing a Lockman's test. Performing a Lockman's test is a discrete skill. And if you have the same patient presenting the same way, in the same setting, under the same amount of stress, and you do that for 10,000 hours, you'll be pretty
You're going to
good.
be perfect at it. Yeah.
But that really doesn't, that's an unfair, I think it's an oversimplified version of what life is and what clinical practice is. And so being able to adjust and being able to pull in different ways of thought are also critical. And I think when we look at the profession, I also think that collectively we have an excellent opportunity to bring in range thinking or wider thinking as we move to the professional level masters. Why? Because we can start to have new learners come in, maybe with a psychology undergraduate degree, maybe with a fine arts undergraduate degree, maybe with a mechanical engineering undergraduate degree, maybe with a biomedical science undergraduate degree. All of those are different ways of thought. And then now we can start to solve some of our most pressing challenges in athletic training by bringing different ways of thought into what we do in the profession of athletic training. I think that it's the generalist is someone who may be called a dabbler, or someone who really is like dives into something for a little bit and gets bored with it and goes and dives into something else. And if you look at them, they're like, well, you didn't follow any sort of trajectory. You didn't go from undergrad to grad school to an internship to another internship to an assistant athletic trainer to an associate athletic trainer. Like, you're not qualified for this because you've dabbled in all of these other areas. If you use the generalist skill set, you've approached problems that we all face from so many different perspectives that now you're able to integrate that information. And I think that's really the core of a generalist, of an athletic trainer who practices as a generalist. And that's really the skill set as an integrator, to be able to say, here are all the factors that are influencing this patient's return to play, or that are influencing this patient's challenge, or if we even take it out of patient care, that these are all of the things that, from my perspective, could be challenging the way we are currently practicing, like the way
Hmm.
we're doing business as athletic trainers.
Yeah.
What if you get a specialist who has spent their entire life looking at this narrow perspective?
Yeah.
They've dug a really deep hole, and it's hard for them to get above the horizon to see the
Right.
entire landscape.
Well, and so, okay, a few things come to mind there. So, one, I think that society very much values a specialist, right? And we, in many ways, want to like concisely define ourselves based on the career path that we've taken. And we want to be able to succinctly say, I've done this and then I've done this, which has led to this, which is why I'm eligible for this, right? And um, I think that that's something that maybe is human nature of wanting it to be, kind of put in a pretty little package so that we can tie the bow on top. Um, but I do wonder, like, how do we help the athletic trainer define themselves as a generalist in a way that comes across as valuable to the person that they're talking to? And an immediate thought that comes to mind for me is like, I had always struggled with feeling like making the transition to business was relevant for my clients because I've got 2 degrees in science. And I always made the joke that, like, I'm not a business person, I'm a science person. But the more work that I've done, and even in reading this book, I realized like part of the reason I am good in business is because I don't have business degrees. Like, so whether, it's like the
Yeah.
preconceived notions of like having to write a business plan or the way that marketing is supposed to be done, I wasn't fed any of that. So I just kind of guerrilla warfare it and figure it out. And I'm almost better because of it. So it's like my success in business is partially because I do have science degrees. So how do we help, um like I said, the athletic trainer who is really feeling like this idea of being a generalist resonates with them? How do we help them articulate that in a way that kind of combats that feeling of, I need to be a specialist, or I need to have had a trajectory that speaks to why, this position or whatever it is, I'm eligible for, despite maybe my experience saying that I am?
That's a really good question. And a metaphor popped into my mind, and it may not make any sense. So if I start to go off the deep end, just let me know.
Okay.
I think, I think regardless of the path we think we want to be on, we want to think of ourselves as unidimensional. Like we want to think of ourselves as a square, and our job is to make ourselves the best square we can. So
Hmm.
as we progress through professional education, as we progress through post-professional education, as we take our first job, second job, third job, whatever that is, our job is to sharpen the corners of the square, right? To
Hmm.
make the prettiest square possible. I think
Right.
that is the perspective, because the prettiest square is going to be the one that gets whatever that desired destination is, that dream job.
R- Right. Right.
And I think for that athletic trainer who has this calling towards being a generalist, it's really about reframing the perspective and saying that we're multidimensional. We're not a square, we're actually a cube. And so
Hmm.
what we've always been a cube. We've always
Okay.
been a dice, right? We've always been this cube. But what
Yeah.
we've done is only show the world one side of us. So we've been
Hmm.
trying to make ourselves look perfect, so we're perfectly aligned at 90 degrees and 90 degrees, so it
Yeah.
looks perfectly square. But if you as the individual pivot just 45 degrees, right? And maybe even pivot 45 degrees up. Now you can show the world that you're multidimensional, that you are a
I see.
multidimensional provider. And that right there adds so much more value than a perfect
Hmm.
square. A perfect square fits into the hole that they've already created. Whereas if you view yourself as multidimensional, working in a square world, if you view yourself as three-dimensional, working in a one-dimensional world, you've
Yeah.
now positioned yourself
Hmm.
to be valuable to an organization, to be valuable to the patients that you work with, to be valuable to the profession, to be valuable to people around you
Yeah.
in an exponential way. Like
Right.
and it starts, it does not start with the viewer. It does not start with a person who judges the square. It
Mm.
starts with you. You
Hmm.
have to pivot yourself
Yeah.
first. Once you've pivoted yourself and you like shine in that three-dimensional world and you show, just like you were talking about, like you are good at business because you're showing yourself without someone telling you this is what business looks like. I
Exactly.
think
Yeah.
oftentimes, I'm an educator, but and I think, but we often show, we try to model what our notions of what athletic training is,
Yeah.
not of what your notion of athletic training may be. And we have to develop our own identity as a multidimensional healthcare provider, as a multidimensional athletic trainer. And
Hmm.
when we do that, we can let ourselves shine. And that's how we market ourselves
Yeah.
is, and that's the not market ourselves, but that's how the individual athletic trainer who wants to be a generalist steps into the light to show that a generalist adds a different type of value and has a different adds a different type of value to your organization or to the problems you're facing versus a specialist. You pretty much know what you're going to get with a specialist. And I think David Epstein talks about this in the book, and it resonates with me, is when you write grants for like the National Institutes of Health, you're never taking any risks. You pretty
Hmm.
much know what the answer is going to be before you
Got it.
start the project. They're not
Hmm.
funding, very rarely are they funding projects that are truly risky. Like they don't know
Yeah.
the outcome
Yeah.
because it's a group of specialists being evaluated by another group of specialists, and they all understand this very, very small bit of knowledge.
Yeah.
And so it makes the competition pool much smaller. But if we would integrate some outside of the box thinking,
Hmm.
some between the box thinking, then we're able to connect these things where we'll lead to true breakthroughs, where we'll actually discover something again and not just
Hmm.
reaffirm what we already think we know. I
Mm.
think that's for
Hmm.
athletic trainers. We can't just continue to reaffirm what we already know. We have to
Okay. Yeah.
discover what we don't know.
And that's what's scary.
Yes, yes,
And to explore it in ways that don't require us to go deeper, that
right.
require us to go wider. Um, just when you said that, it reminded me like I'm such a fan of weak side theory. So there's strong versus weak side theory, which I actually got from Malcolm Gladwell. I think it may have been Tipping Point or Blink, one of his, where essentially he argues that so weak side theory is that you want to strengthen your weaknesses. So if you use like a sports analogy, you're only as good as the worst man on the bench. Whereas strong side theory is you're not concerned with how weak your weakest person is. You dump kind of all of your strengths and resources into the strongest person. So if you have LeBron, then it doesn't matter who else is on the team because you've got LeBron, for example. And I've always been a fan of weak side theory. Like you're only as strong as your weakest point. And there's no like right versus wrong. It's really just a matter of like what resonates with you. And so when you said that right now, it makes me think like that's a very vulnerable position to be in, to just constantly be seeking what is my weakest point, and I know that about myself, but that's not always something that as a provider or even just as a practicing professional that you would want to readily admit or expose. But I think that in the larger conversation about being a generalist, that's exactly what it is. Like the weak side theory belongs to the generalist,
Mhm.
whereas the strong side theory belongs to the specialist, because they're going to double down on what it is that they excel at the most. And they're going to do further continuing education, and they're going to get, even more specialized in that clinical skill. And again, like you need both in the world. You can't just have one or the other. But it just was another like
Mhm.
thing that I think we've talked about and I've read that just kind of gets all wrapped up in this kind of generalist versus specialist.
Like strong side theory works for it works for the individual clinician, right? It
Yes,
works for LeBron.
it works for LeBron.
It
Yeah,
works for LeBron, right?
yeah,
That's just the way it is. Where
yeah.
weak side theory works for the patient. If we think about this from a
Mm,
healthcare perspective,
yeah,
by us identifying where we're weak and putting the patient first,
yeah,
moving our ego out of the way, because I
yeah.
also think, again, it's not one's better than the other, but I also tend to lean towards weak side theory unless you have the resources to build, right, like
That's the other
you
thing
have
I
the
was going to
resource
say is
if you're not
strong
good at,
side theory requires resources.
right, like if
Yeah,
you got the if you're not good at marketing, you have the money to buy or to pay for a marketing person, then don't waste your time on that. But it requires
exactly.
resources, and oftentimes that's one of the barriers that we cite in athletic training, is that we don't have resources. So
Right.
considering the environment in which we work in, weak side theory fits better, particularly for who we are serving. We're
Mm,
not serving ourselves, we're
yeah,
serving the patients that we work with. That's why we're in it. And
right.
if we can create a network of where we feel safe to say, hey, I'm not the strongest at this, but Alicia right down the road, she is really good at this. So
Yeah,
how about let's coordinate something so Alicia can see you,
yeah,
and we can get you the best care. And again, it it is difficult to work through if we use the constraints where we're currently at,
yes.
because we the locations that we work within,
Hmm.
particularly in the traditional sports settings, exist in finite games or kind environments in which
Yeah,
sharing resources is not okay.
exactly. Yeah,
And it, and there's no easy answer to that, except we have to have a vision of where we want to go so we can start to build those bridges, or really build the tunnels that we need to have in order to to be at a place where we feel safe, and to say I am good at these things and I am not good at these other things, and that in and of itself be your strength. Your ability to authentically self-evaluate
yeah,
is has to be a strength for
yeah,
this to work. It can't be perceived as a weakness. It can't be
right.
perceived as less than, either by yourself internally being less than, or by the decision makers who are deciding whether to hire you or promote you or not. It
Yeah,
really requires a a pivot and a reframe of of what strengths and weaknesses and how we practice. And that's totally like a non-discrete answer,
yeah.
but it requires a collective effort. And honestly, it's going to require some some innovators to say, I'm willing to put myself out there for this.
That's what I was going to say is like it requires a level of acceptance within ourselves. And I think that that's where you and I wanted to at least start this conversation. Like we've got to introduce this idea. We've got to create some level of permission that thereby could create acceptance within people, that when we talk about this, they're like, that's me. Like that's not only who I am, but that's who I want to be. I don't desire to be a specialist. I really see myself as a generalist, but for so long we have prized or, put emphasis on the specialist. And so we do need that cultural shift. So yes, it starts with the acceptance, but that person then needs to say that. Like, we need the spokespeople to be coming out and saying, this is who I am, this is how I practice, and this is why I'm still valuable. Like, I am not any less of an athletic trainer. I'm not any less valuable than someone else who isn't practicing the way that I am, because the ability for us to get to where we're envisioning the things that you've said, where there's, frontline generalists and backline specialists that all are athletic trainers, we're referring intra-professionally. It's not even inter-professionally at that point. We need, like you said, those innovators or those people that are willing to step into that role, to say that out loud. And then it kind of starts to pave the way for other people to say, I'm a generalist also. And it makes it okay. And I hate to say it that way, because like, it is okay, but it doesn't feel that way right now, I guess.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. And there are, I think if you're we're going to use this cube and square analogy, metaphor. If you are a cube in a square world, people are going to say you're different and you don't belong.
Yeah.
And that hurts.
It's hard to feel that way.
Yeah. It says you don't look like me.
Yep.
You don't act like me. Right. And I think that is another role for athletic trainers who may not be at the right place in their career, or they feel like they're not in the right place to say, I'm ready to do this for myself. If you're not ready to do it for yourself, that's okay too. But be inclusive and be supportive of those, of your colleagues and of your friends and your professional network that say, I want to be a cube in a square world. I want to be a generalist, because that takes a tremendous amount of vulnerability. And if we choose not to be supportive of individuals who take risks, we're creating an environment that's not sustainable, that is not infinite, that is filled with competition as opposed to fulfillment. And togetherness. And some people may be listening to this and saying, that's too kumbaya. How do you, bless you. That's too kumbaya, and that's not how it really works. But it can work that way.
It can,
And it starts with us choosing to either, one, be vulnerable enough to take the risk, knowing full well that we may fail. And if we fail, guess what? We're human. We are resilient. Stand up, brush yourself off, and try again.
Totally.
And for those who are not at that place, or they're not ready at this moment, or they may not be there, to support those in your network, or support those who aren't in your network, but you're connected to them on social media or something, to support those individuals who are willing to be vulnerable, because that's the how of how we're going to transform ourselves and make the leap from the generalist who has to know everything but feels like they know nothing and always feels behind, to this new framework of frontline generalist with backline specialist and referral, intra-professional referral among and between and within ourselves as athletic trainers.
I mean, I don't know when that will happen, but it's a beautiful thing to imagine, not only the level of acceptance within the profession that you're describing, because there is just a lot of shaming and naysayers, and a lot of, what can you do for me, or how does this benefit me, that we can really be actively working away from. while also not having to expose ourselves or not having to figure out, am I a generalist? Am I a specialist? So I definitely appreciate that you brought that up. And yeah, I just think generally speaking, this isn't one of those conversations where we're going to be able to put a bow on it. Like a lot of times we can come to a conclusion. I think this one was more about introducing the idea of this, and hopefully it spawns further conversation for people who are watching, or just further exploration within yourself to figure out, does this make sense for me? Or like you said, when you hear someone else talk about it, or if they're feeling challenged by something, that you can introduce this idea of a generalist versus a specialist. Yeah, and it's something that we're probably going to have to keep a pulse on, over the next several years, to see, how is this unfolding in the profession, and how is it that we are creating levels of acceptance and participating in weak side theory and all the things that we've introduced here. But yeah, I think it was like a great way to kind of weave together a lot of what we've talked about with strong application to the profession. But it's just not one of those ones where we can like deliver a whole bunch of answers to the audience, which I know they've probably become accustomed to with our conversations.
Well, I'd really love it if you are watching this, or you've watched this, or you're watching it recorded. If you have questions, or not even questions, comments, engage in the conversation, because that's the only way we collectively all can continue
Right.
this conversation and to move forward, because that's what it's all about. And I think I've used this quote before, but we've got to be willing to plant the seeds of trees that we're never going to be able to enjoy. Like,
Yeah.
that's where we're at right now. And I fully understand that what we're talking about, I personally will not be able to benefit from.
Right.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
That's okay, because it's an infinite game, and
I was
it's
just going to
bigger
say
than
that
me.
it's an infinite game.
Right? I'm not trying to win anything.
Right.
Yes, it's nice to be recognized and all of that stuff,
Sure. Yeah.
but it's the profession of athletic training is going to continue on whether I'm part of it or not.
Yep.
And I'm part of it, so I might as well try, or we might as well try, not just me.
Yeah.
We all might as well try to make it better
Right.
while we're here.
Yeah.
So yeah, just one more call. If you are listening to this, if you're watching this, if this is a clip and you're interested, have some discussions, leave us a comment, leave us some questions, because I think that this is something where there are so many roots and tentacles and branches and different directions that this can go. It could be, if we use generalist thinking, it is really valuable if we have these different rabbit holes to be able to zoom back and look at how all of these things are connected, because that's where we're going to solve problems. That's where we're going to be able to chart a future course. That's where we're really going to be able to discover something new.
Yeah. I would say it's just, this is such a preliminary conversation, like it's infant in what we can even surmise that it might be. And so, like you said, if you're listening to this and you're watching it back, and something's coming to mind, or something has revealed itself in your career, it would be awesome, because it's going to take several years for us to really see any fruit of planting this seed, which obviously is part of the beauty too, right?
Even if it feels like it's not relevant, that's the thing, right? Like,
that's the point. Yeah.
in a generalist mindset, there are no wrong answers, because every piece is a piece.
A piece. Yeah, I was going to say it's a piece. Yeah.
It's not necessarily a piece to the puzzle, because there is no puzzle, because the puzzle is a finite game. It's a piece.
Yeah.
And it's a snapshot of your perspective. And
I was going to say, and
valuable
it's your individual experience. It's that what you are going through is just as valuable as what anybody else might be. And that's the whole point, is that you could be on polar opposite ends or working in completely different settings, or it may not seem like it applies, but then yet it's like the very thing that someone needed to be told in order to unlock that final piece for them, so it sharing it, putting it out there. It's all part of how we create those levels of acceptance. We start the conversation and we keep things going and moving towards this kind of idyllic world that you've created of athletic training in the future. Awesome. Well, as always, thank you for being here. It's fun to just chat with you. I know, people, this may not always resonate, but what's also cool is, maybe 2 or 3 years from now, we're going to go back to this conversation and say, we were talking about that 2 or 3 years ago, or
Right.
like we've already said, we kind of spark conversation for other people. And it honestly, even if it just touches one person, I think, that's all we look for, all we care about.
Absolutely.
Awesome. All right. We are signing